Hello book nerds, welcome to Bookshelf Bunny. I'm Kim and this is day 15 of Vlogmas. So today I am doing another short book chat. I read a memoir this week. It's called Life in the City of Dirty Water by Clayton Thomas-Muller. And I listened to this as an audiobook. It was a very interesting story. I mean, all memoirs are interesting because it's someone's real life, right? I find it hard to rate a memoir because it's someone else's personal experience. Who am I to judge that? But I did give this one a 4 out of 5 only because the way that he told his story, it wasn't in a concise order. So at times it was a little bit hard to follow. He jumped back and forth between his past and his current days, and it was sometimes hard to follow. But overall, as a memoir, it was very interesting. It was of particular interest to me because it is about the life of an Indigenous man in Canada. Now, I'm not Indigenous. I am the farthest thing from Indigenous. I am as white can get. But I live in a country where reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples is very, very important. I have been lucky enough to be able to participate in Indigenous culture throughout most of my life. I grew up in the part of my city that is, now it's considered a ghetto. Then it didn't seem so bad, but I was also a kid, so I don't know. And there was a lot of inner city kids dealing with a lot of problems, and most of us were low income. And we went to a school that took a lot of time to be multicultural and to share Indigenous culture as part of its curriculum. And this is when I was in elementary school, and that was a long time ago now. And as I've gotten older as an adult and the rest of the country started recognizing the importance of validating the experience of our Indigenous people, it's just become something I'm kind of passionate about, I guess. And so this story is from the perspective of a man who grew up Indigenous in, low-income housing situations in Winnipeg. So a much bigger city than my own city. So I really appreciated his perspective and his experience. His entire story is basically him coming to terms with the intergenerational trauma that has happened in Canada as a result of colonization and oppressing systemically our Indigenous peoples for so many years. In particular, he talks about residential schools. His mother and his uncles and aunts all went to residential schools. He was one of the first generation who didn't. But he talked about how it impacted his people. He also talked about how he got involved in gang life, and because he felt disconnected from his culture and from the land. And he feels like the farther he got from his land, his ancestral home, the more disturbed he became and the harder it was for him to cope. It's a whole journey for him. He goes through, he shares from his childhood growing up in the inner city of Winnipeg, his summers in the trapping lands of his family, and he also talks about his teenage years, kind of couch surfing here and there. He went to juvie, he got involved in gangs, and then eventually, as he paused and he reconnected with himself and he learned about his own culture and things that had been taken from him or from his mom and that he just didn't have the exposure to that he needed. He learned about sweat lodges, he learned about the sun dance, and he came to appreciate himself as an Indigenous man. And eventually he started getting involved in activism in order to speak for his people and for the lands of Indigenous peoples across the world. He was very well traveled. It's a fascinating story. And I really appreciated his story. It was very good. So again, I am not Indigenous in any way, shape, or form. And while I also grew up low income, and I had a lot of interaction with Indigenous cultures growing up, I cannot relate on the same level. And it's important to me to hear firsthand stories from Indigenous people sharing their experience, because it helps me understand. And I think that's important, because Canada right now is all about reconciliation, and I think that's vital. All right, book nerds, that's all I got for you. It was a very interesting read. I would recommend it. Again, I gave it a 4 out of 5. It would have had a 5 out of 5 hands down for being a memoir alone. But because it was not very organized in terms of it jumped around a lot and it was hard to follow in places, it's the only reason it got a 4 out of 5. Otherwise, it's fascinating, and I recommend checking it out. All right, that's it for me. I'll leave you with some Christmas lights and some adventures of Bookie, and I'll see you tomorrow.